Well, welcome back, everybody, to yet another attempt at distinguishing good from bad science. Today, our subject is masks. Now, it was always clear. Masks, the cult of the mask, the mask mandates, the lawlessness of going without a mask, that sort of thing. And it's always been clear that the masks really don't work. The mask mandates certainly don't work. Look, if you have a full-on spacesuit, equipped with oxygen tanks or with filters down below the viron level, this is going to protect you from inhaling a respiratory virus. We can all admit that, as long as you have it on. And if you don't have to change the filter, and you don't eat, or don't drink, or use the facilities. So it can be said masks work in blocking the spread of bugs, but only in that sense. The flimsy, plastic, cheesy, gappy, snot-filled, breath-soaked surgical masks, the panicked, hand-wringing, shaking, fear-filled hysterics, made it a crime not to wear. Well, those are crap. So that below, when we or later in this podcast, I should say, when I say masks, these and their cloth cousins are the kind I mean. Always acknowledging, to be fair, the spacesuit-like masks will work, but only for the time they're being worn. And this was always obvious, as I say. Obvious, that is, if you weren't judging the evidence from the I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die mindset. But to be fair, this was the only mindset possible if you watched any TV in 2020 or listened to almost any American ruler. Panic softens minds. Panic destroys rationality. Panic kills. But oh my, do we love a good panic. It's the true American way. And say, did you think, dear listener, that you, during the doom panic, were the first to think of trying masks to stop the inevitable? All we can do is sigh. During the Spanish flu a century ago, which was really something to worry about, we had our first experience with mask mandates. Certain cities made people wear them. I think St. Louis and perhaps San Francisco. I might have those cities wrong. I'll have to go back and look. Those mask mandates didn't work then. Science magazine, the very same science magazine that we have today, on 30 May 1919, okay, over a century ago, had an article by a fellow named George Soper, who was a member of the Sanity Corps. No, was it the Sanity Corps or the Sanitation Corps? Maybe it's the same thing. Anyway, he had an article entitled "The Lesson of the Pandemic." So they were already looking at evidence starting then. This was not the only article, but this, I think, was the first that came out to look at masks and other measures taken during the Spanish flu pandemic. And he concluded, he was not against masks, but he concluded that it is not, quote, "it is not desirable to make the general wearing of masks compulsory," end quote. Well, like I said, there were many papers that followed, and that wasn't the final word. Science did not sit still. It had been a long century of accumulating evidence over and again. Long after it was plain masks didn't work, that masks don't work in stopping the spread of respiratory viruses. I have a list of old studies on the blog that masks don't work. And there's many such lists. Cato Institute has one for cloth masks showing they don't work, a bunch of papers. I'll just read some titles here. This is from 2009. Jacobs, use of surgical face masks to reduce the incidence of common cold among healthcare workers in Japan. A randomized controlled trial shows it didn't work. It said N95 masks were significantly more likely, people wearing them were significantly more likely to experience headaches. Face masks used were not, no benefit in preventing cold symptoms or getting colds. Cowling in 2010, face masks to prevent transmission of influenza virus, a systematic review on epidemiology and infection. None of the studies in that review showed a benefit from wearing a mask. Nothing. Bin Reza et al. 2012, the use of mask and respiratory. On and on and on. This is influenza respiratory viruses. There were 17 eligible studies they reviewed. None of the studies established a conclusive relationship between mask and respirator and protection against influenza. On and on and on and on. Here's another one. This is my favorite. This one is my favorite because it came out in May of 2020, right as the panic was, at full heat, I guess you could say. And it must have, because it came out in the journal at that time, it must have been written before this. And indeed, here's the title. It's by Xiao and others. It's a meta-analysis itself, like so many of these papers are. It's non-pharmaceutical measures for pandemic influenza and non-healthcare settings, personal, protective, and environmental measurements. And the journal was Emerging Infectious Diseases. All right. Now, I have a picture on the blog, and you got to look. I think I'll maybe use this picture for the podcast graphic, I guess. The picture is of several of meta-analyses. The picture is a picture of a meta-analysis of several studies looking at mask use combined with hand hygiene. All right? Washing hands in ordinary settings like shopping and walking. They don't work. Mask nothing. There's no difference in catching the flu between wearing masks and not, and even washing hands. That's kind of funny, and we'll learn a little bit more about that too. It's just, of course, washing hands. Well, you think, well, why? The evidence says we should be washing hands. Well, yeah, especially if you're, getting gastronomic sort of bacteria and the like, avoiding that. But for respiratory viruses, which you're sucking up through the air, your hand washing is not going to be too effective. Here's another one. Universal masking in the COVID-19 era. This is another favorite. This was in the New England Journal of Medicine by Klompus and others. Now, they had come out not that long before this. This was on 9 July 2020, and they came out, I don't know, like a month before or something, stating that their earlier conclusion was, quote, wearing a mask outside healthcare facilities offers little, if any, protection from infection. And they got an enormous blowback. The intelligentsia went bat guano apoplectic over this paper. So they had to write a retraction. The best they could do, though, they say, well, we didn't really mean what we said. I have the whole link. You can read it. It's just hilarious. That's just two of many such papers. Many. And we, of course, we all recall the fabulous Fauci on 60 Minutes early in the panic telling the truth about masks. He said, don't bother. And then he started lying about them. Well, we all know that, too. But you got to think, the critics said, aha, those old studies, all those old studies, the hundreds of old studies, those were for the flu and the cold. Masks might still work in stopping corona doom. Well, what can you do but laugh? And because right after this was concluded, this genius idea, that there came studies showing, marvel of marvels, that the old work was all wrong. All these hundreds of studies across various settings on every continent but Antarctica, all of that was wrong. And that the panicked rulers of 2020 were right. Masklessness should be criminalized. That's what the science said. Well, how did this happen? Even after study after study after study, even a study, I have a link, that surgeons even needn't wear them to reduce infections in their patients. This is, the paper title is A Mask Necessary in the Operating Theater by Orr in the Annals of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. All of these other studies showed the opposite. So how did all of a sudden papers all of a sudden started showing masks work where they hadn't for a century before? Well, I'll give you, in a word, motivation. The new papers were of the kind, we strapped a mask to a dummy and modeled laminar and turbulent flow in a closed room with no movement, no eating, no talking, no sneezing, no wheezing, and none of the realities. And lo, papers, all of these kind of papers showed masks work, but only if you wore at least 2 and possibly 3 masks. Or we had papers like the CDC. which embrace the epidemiologist fallacy. And I've talked about this many times, and if you don't remember, I have a link. But they embrace the epidemiologist fallacy with a grip tighter than a drag queen pawing the kitties behind the stacks after a reading hour. They didn't use infections or death or anything insane. They used bizarre derived measures like rates of change. That's not a misstatement there, to prove using p-values that masks work. I have a link to one of their studies I took apart. It's just embarrassing work. I have another one that from the Harvard School of Public Health, who I recently learned has blocked me on Twitter. I never interacted with them, but I guess they found out about me. And some of my criticisms of their work. Hey, it's science. Now, there were two big studies early on about masks. One of which was the Bangladeshi study, which shows, at best, a population seroprevalence. A seroprevalence that's of if they could know whether or not you had the infection. So it shows at best a population seroprevalence reduction of the doom viruses between the masked and a no mask group of 0.0026% at best, and it's likely smaller. And then there was that big study. There was one study they did right in Denmark early on. They actually measured what you were supposed to measure. They had a big experiment. They told everybody. I have a link in the blog on all these things, but had a big experiment. They had one large group wearing masks. They were given the best masks. They were all taught how to use them. Thousands and thousands of people, I can't remember, tens of thousands of people in this study. And the one group was trained how to use these masks, change it when it's soiled, all that kind of thing. Here's how to wear it tightly, whatever, so on and so forth. And then one group was left mask-free. And the result? No difference between the groups. And so the reaction from hersterics like Nassim Taleb was just amusing. They shouted things like, "Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence," and "You psychopath." that was a real quote, by the way, the psychopath. That's from Taleb, who claimed everybody who wasn't panicking was a psychopath. That's the very word he used in print in a real journal. Okay, so finally, the big news this week, and the reason for this podcast is a day or two ago, was it yesterday? I am already losing track of time here. Another Cochrane review. There's been others. I have links to them in those first links. This one's by Jefferson and others, entitled "Physical Interventions to Interrupt or Reduce the Spread of Respiratory Viruses." Now, these guys, I'm not a big fan of Cochrane or anything like this. These are the evidence-based medicine crowd. These people consider themselves rationalists and worship p-values and all this kind of crap. Well, whatever. But if they can't prove mask work, then nobody's going to be able to. This is a quote now. I'll kind of freely quote this. "Wearing masks in a community probably makes little or no difference to the outcome of influenza like illnesses, like COVID-19, like illnesses, compared to not wearing masks. The risk ratio is around 1. They had 9 trials with about 300,000 participants. They have moderate certainty of the evidence, meaning the evidence is good papers, in their opinion, that kind of thing. So not every paper is worth anything, but they consider these 9 trials to be worthy of inclusion in their database. Wearing masks in a community probably makes little or no difference to the outcome of laboratory confirmed influenza, SARS-CoV-2, compared to not wearing masks. The risk ratio here is 1.01. They give confidence intervals on them too, enormous, 0.72 to 1.42. Enormous number of participants, a lot of trials, moderate certainty evidence, again, meaning they like these papers. Harms were, this is their words now, harms were rarely measured and poorly reported. So they have very low certainty evidence on that because people didn't report on harms. But did they? We'll come back to that. They continue. "We are very uncertain on the effects of the N95 P2 respirators compared with medical surgical masks on the outcome of clinical respiratory illnesses. The use of the N95 respirators compared to medical surgical masks makes probably little or no difference for the objective and more precise outcome of laboratory confirmed influenza infection. So the N95s that were touted by everybody, they don't work either. They were very squeamish in their language, I think you can see here. Probably makes no difference. They got a risk ratio of 1. Because, look, I have a little sympathy for these guys. They know what happened to all the others who questioned the cult of the mask during the panic. They saw what happened to those authors, and they don't want that kind of grief. Still, they did man up and come to the right conclusion. Masks don't work. There's all the evidence, but they left a little wiggle room in there, and they're probably don't work. Look, the burden of proof is on you, people, in the cult of the mask. You can't just say masks work because masks work, and therefore you have to do them because I am an expert. You have to provide that burden of proof, which was never provided, and indeed could not be, and never was. And now what's all this about the harms of wearing masks? The harms, yeah. Masks can cause harm. I got some links on this. The most infamous example was the absolute shrieking, banshee shrinking that appeared after the paper Face Masks in the COVID-19 Era, a Health Hypothesis. And I'm going to mispronounce this guy's name. Vainshellboim, Vainshellboim. I don't know. That's the name. Anyway, he published this paper. It has very specific masks harms in there of the kind you already know about. They can increase infections. They can lead to facial infections. They can lead to all kinds of other things. And the kids are not learning to speak as well. All this kind of stuff that you already know about. Anyway, this was absolutely verboten. The cult of the mask would not stand for it and didn't. They got the paper withdrawn. But as I show in the link that you could see, their attempts at murdering his ideas fail utterly. Every critique they launched at him was ridiculously stupid. So anyway, we didn't need these papers. It was obvious as anything that masks cause one specific and deadly harm. We didn't need studies to know this. They spread fear and panic. That's it. We know that they spread fear and panic. How many times has this happened to you, dear maskless listener? You walk up to or past a group of mask wearers, and they move to their faces to tighten their masks. I had one guy look at me, saw me, his eyes widened, and he moved up instinctively to pinch the mask around his nose, and then he turned his head and faced a wall until I walked past. Idiot. In their panicked minds, that you are unmasked means you're probably infected, and that just being near you increases their chance of dying. And how about the brilliant The Science, where you didn't need a mask in a restaurant while sitting down? But if you stood up, oh boy, all of a sudden you needed a mask. That's what the science showed. That's the kind of special kind of idiot fear that can only be spread by masks. Now, none of this evidence about the uselessness of masks or the positive harm they cause will mean anything to the people in the cult of the mask, or in those cultures like in East Asia, Japan, China, and so forth, that have a near religious belief in masks. They know masks work because they insist masks work. Now, how can you argue with that? The answer? You cannot. Thanks for listening, everybody.